Morning, Beryl. How are you?
Hello,
Now, Beryl,
everybody.
you're from Seattle, aren't you? Spoke or well,
Beryl, you need to undo your mute. You can't be heard. Push the space bar down.
there.
Okay,
Down, can you hear me?
you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, we are in Seattle. Yeah,
Okay.
and it's almost raining here, not quite yet.
And Larry,
morning,
good morning to
everybody.
you.
Morning.
Is
How's
this a
it
good
going?
time to begin?
Is that you, David?
Yeah, is this a good time to begin?
Yeah, we're at the time. So
Okay, welcome everybody. This is First Kings, chapter 3, beginning with verse 5. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night and said, "Ask what I should give you." And Solomon said, "You have shown great and steadfast love to your servant, my father David, because he walked before you in faithfulness, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart toward you. And you have kept him for this great and steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on his throne today. And now, O Lord, my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, although I am only a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of the people whom you have chosen, a great people, so numerous they cannot be numbered or counted. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people and to discern between good and evil. For who can govern this, your great people?" It pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this. God said to him, "Because you have asked this and have not asked for yourself long life or riches or for the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right, I now do according to your word. Indeed, I give you a wise and discerning mind. No one like you has been before you, and no one like you shall come after you. I give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor all of your life. No other king shall compare to you. If you walk in my ways as your father David did, I will lengthen your life." So let's begin with prayer. Dear God, this is a day when we think about leaders and how they need discerning wisdom. We need it in our own lives. We need it in the lives of our families. We surely need it in the lives of this nation. This morning, about half of our people are happy and about half of our people are not happy. No matter who became president, it would be a very, very difficult time. So we pray for wisdom on the part of everybody, the president and that man, the man who would have been president, and all the rest of us. May we be peacemakers in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, Reinder Bruinsma on the impact of postmodernism. Thank you for being here all the way from the Netherlands, and Alfia as well. I thought I saw her.
All right, I have unmuted myself. And fortunately, both Afje and myself, we are well, even though we still live very much in Corona country. The number of cases, daily cases, is going down a little bit this week, but there have been more restrictions. And we are not in a total lockdown, but for the next 2 weeks, there are very few things that we can do. But thankfully, we have Zoom and other technical means, so I can talk to you, and I can teach this coming week at Friedensau without going there. and I can have plenty of other meetings during the week without having to drive 1 mile. So that's good, even though I miss the physical contact with people and hope that life will soon return to somewhat normal. But I am sure that that is also what you are hoping for in your part of the world. And we are following that very, very closely. Actually, we have watched quite a bit of television today and have seen things develop in the United States. And I can tell you that here in the Netherlands, there is a lot of interest in what is happening across the pond. And so all the news media in the Netherlands have been following it very, very closely. Well, I don't know whether I should congratulate you or should commiserate with you. It depends on your political point of view, I guess. But well, I will not betray where my preference has been, but you figured it out for yourself. So we're going with the second part of our series on postmodernism, and I'm going to try to share my screen, and let's see whether that's going to succeed. I think I just did it.
Yes, Houston, we have liftoff.
Okay, good. It gets a little easier each time, you know, to deal with this technology. Tonight we'll talk on the impact on Western culture. And that's quite a broad subject. It deals with many subtopics. And I do not claim that I have adequate knowledge really about all the various subtopics. And I'm sure there are some among you who do know more about some of these things than I do. And if you feel that you have to correct me, please do so. But let's try and see what you think. If we talk about the postmodern world, then it would be right to say that the personal computer or the iPad or other equipment that let us connect to the internet, that this has become an icon of our present time, of the postmodern world. It allows us to connect with people everywhere, and what we are doing tonight, or rather this morning for you, is a good example that we can connect, but we can also just sit there by ourselves and spend hours at a time or hours every day watching at the screen. In fact, that is what's happening all over the place. We connect via the internet, gives us a lot of information. We have now the verb to Google. That's something that we do when we want to know something. We also have realized that it's always good to check more than one source, because whether or not something is totally correct, that sometimes remains to be seen. It seems that we have gone from an era of wisdom in pre-modern times to an era of knowledge in modern times to an information era. And as we know, we have many virtual communities. There are Sabbath schools all over the place that meet via Zoom or via some other means. There are church services in many places today. There are all kinds of meetings taking place, virtual communities. We're supposed to have different meetings in the coming year for theologians and pastors in Europe, but all of them are going to take place by virtual means. And so we have these virtual communities that are very much now, more than we ever could think, part of our time. The computer is very interesting in that it mixes information and amusement. And with the same piece of equipment, we work and we game and we do all kinds of other things. Sometimes we don't realize how recent much of our present technology is. It was in 1973, which is less than 50 years ago, that the first start of something resembling the internet was started. The establishment of the Adventist research and, let me see where, yeah, something going wrong here. Advanced and Projects Network. Then we had in 1975 the first personal computer, and 79 the first cellular phone. And we all know how bulky those first cellular phones were. Afje and myself, we left for Africa in 1984. And when we moved from Cameroon to Ivory Coast, we bought our first computers. It was an IBM clone that was imported to Africa. And, you know, it was one of these things that had a couple of floppy disks on which you could have, I think, less than one megabyte. And so that's a huge difference with the kind of equipment we are using some 25 years later. We wouldn't go to many places, many of us, without having our GPS, but that's only 20 years ago, since that became mainstream. Google, 2004, Facebook, 2006, the launch of the iPhone, 2007. I need to do something here because the place where I need to find the next slide is covered with pictures. Yeah, I think I got it done again. Okay. So, and in 2011, I just Googled that today to see when we actually had our first Zoom meetings. The first Zoom meeting was held not less than 9 years ago. Now, almost the whole world is using it. When we talk about the impact of postmodernism on culture, one of the first things I want to mention is the impact on literature. I found this definition that is, I think, quite apt. Postmodern literature is a form of literature which is marked both stylistically and ideologically, so form and content, by a reliance on such literary conventions as fragmentation, paradox, unreliable narrators, often unrealistic and downright implausible plots, games, parody, paranoia, dark humor, and authorial self-reference. Well, what does that mean? When we see some of these postmodern books, we often see a blurring of the fictional and the historical. And as we remember from my talk last week, that is one of the characteristics of postmodernism, that things are getting mixed and that there's fragmentation and that there are different things that seem on the surface not to fit together. And you have many books today that blur the fictional and the historical. And historical writers write historical novels, think they are at liberty to also add fictional elements. Many of the books you have apocalyptic and anti-rational elements and absurdity, dreams and visions and miracle and fantasy are often mentioned, and they're novels which operate on different levels. And then we have the phenomenon of a literary thriller. And you would think that a thriller is not literature, at least that's how people thought in the past, but there is such a genre today as the literary thriller. Some examples. I haven't read them all, and there are many more. If you go to the internet and you Google postmodern novels, you get long lists of examples of what is considered to be a postmodern novel. A fascinating book, which I read quite a few years ago, Franz Kafka, The Castle, and I suppose many of you have read that. It's actually a kind of parable, and it is different from most other books that I read before. A more recent example would be the book The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. Now, when you read that, and Umberto Eco, he is a language scientist, or was rather, because he died a couple of years ago. He wrote many books, many articles that were probably read by less than 100 people because they were very sophisticated and learned. But he also decided to write some stuff that would be accessible to a large audience. And yet his philosophy, his message somehow been contained in that. The Name of the Rose plays, as you know, or some of you will know, in a monastery, and it's very, very cleverly written. And when you read it, you get after a while the idea that you see the place before you and that you know where you should find certain parts of the monastery, and you find your way in the monastery. But it's at the same time, it's a story about a crime that has been committed and that must be solved. And you find lots of biblical statements, and you find actually lots of Latin quotations also in the book that, well, many readers probably will just skip. But it's a very interesting mix of a number of things, but it's extremely fascinating. You see some other titles mentioned here. I printed Murakami in bold. I think I have read most of the books by Murakami, a Japanese author, and many of his books, and certainly the Wind Up Bird Chronicles, for which he is especially known, are weird. But in a way, they're fascinating, and at least I found that I kept on reading and kept on being surprised by what came next. In postmodern literature, postmodern writing, there is also the interest in the supernatural, in the occult, and possibly the best known examples might be what Tolkien has been doing in The Lord of the Rings, and then of course Mrs. Rowling, the British author, in the Harry Potter series. It should be noted that postmodern authors are more than writers. They are supposed also to help sell their books. They are supposed to be active on the social media. They're supposed to be active in giving lectures. They are supposed to be part of the whole marketing process. And that is what is expected of the author today. I do not know all that much about postmodern film, but there also you see the merging of the real world with fiction. And one of the earliest ones was Who Framed Roger Rabbit, a mixing of real persons and cartoons. And then films that treat the fictitious themes very seriously. Now, I'm not a great admirer of Star Wars and Star Trek. Maybe some of you are, but that is often cited as one of the great examples of postmodern movies. The one who has written quite a bit about postmodern movies is a postmodern philosopher, Jean Baudrillard, and he says that the film really is no longer an image of the real. The film itself becomes the real, in particular when you have disaster films. And then he gives a couple of other comments about postmodern film. And I think the last sentence is important, that film is not just a film, but it's big business. It has computer, it has games and gadgets and commercial spin-offs. It is more than just the movie. But some of you will probably know a lot more about postmodern films. An example that is usually cited as one of the really postmodern movies is The Matrix. And another one that is often cited is Face Off. And you find in these movies a lot of elements that are mixed together. There are religious elements, ideas from all religions in the Matrix, and even more so in Face Off. But there are many other postmodern films that have these characteristics. Now, postmodernity also has had a major influence on television. And television in many ways shapes our view of reality. And the way it did that started to some extent with the Gulf War. And then a little later with the invasion of Somalia. I remember in 1993 that I was sitting in a hotel room in Harare in Zimbabwe, Africa, at a time when the invasion by the American army took place in Somalia. And I was fascinatingly watching on CNN in my hotel room there. And this was one of the better hotels. So even at that time, they had CNN in the hotel. I think it was a Marriott hotel. And I was watching the major part of a day, how actually the American soldiers landed in Somalia. The television was there, and it gave a very clear view of what was happening. But there should be a caveat with that when we say that, because it makes quite a bit of difference which of the media you're looking at. And this is maybe especially clear when you see the difference between such media as CNN versus Fox. And of course, we have similar situations also in other countries, and certainly also in the Netherlands, where we have different media that portray very different points of view. But the view of reality by many people is to a large extent determined what either they see on CNN or what they see on Fox or on some other medium that they prefer. One of the things also by watching these programs on television is that it is often impossible to determine the scope and the size of an event. Just before this started, I was looking at CNN and saw the crowd before the White House, before the gates of the White House. And of course, there is no way of determining whether there were 500 people or 5,000 people or 10,000 people. And often when you look at images that are taken from conflicts, day after day, you are shown the same images. And these images, they are often taken from a certain angle, from a certain position, and it's really difficult to know the scope of an event. So it shapes our view of reality, but it's very often a view that is may not be correct. That's one part of television. The other important part is that it's mixing information and amusement, to some extent what we see with the personal computer. You have the docu soaps, documentary kind of mix with a soap, reality TV, whatever that is. It has always fascinated me when looking at American programs or being in America and looking at television, that everything on television is referred to as a show. Now, to me, the word show has something, it's not serious, it's amusement. And so the news show must always have an amusement element. It seems that's part of the deal. And you have usually more than one anchor person and they joke with one another. You have this mix of seriousness, of real news with amusement. And of course, there are the ever ongoing quizzes on television, which are supposed to be educational. I don't know whether that is true at American television, but that is certainly true at Dutch television. The postmodern phenomenon par excellence, it's now somewhat in the past, but that was MTV. And I think many of you remember MTV. The program was sold in the mid-1980s and became a different kind of program after that. But when it started in the 70s and 80s, you remember it was a continuous flow without narration, without any structure, and certainly without any meaning. Different kind of artistic genres, and you had all kinds of clips and combining art and commerce, etc., etc. That is seen as certainly a postmodern phenomenon par excellence. The impact of postmodernity on the theater, that's an area where I must admit I know very little about, but certainly when that started in the 70s and 80s, in particular in Europe, there was not just the classical way of having a play with a good story, but there was theater with audience participation and the use of parallel media, film and video. And very often when the program would be repeated the next evening or the evening after, it would not quite be the same because there was not always the same kind of text that the actors would be following, and other kinds of things might be happening in the participation of the audience. And here another area where I know very little about, but many of you may recognize what you see on the screen, that in music has changed because now there is the possibility of using electronics in the recording, in the mixing of the music. And there are all kinds of different kinds of popular music. Some of them have a very global attraction, but many are also borrowing from local styles and mixing all kinds of styles, which is to some extent also happening on the classical scene, where you see serious composers borrowing from the total of musical tradition. And one particular example, and somebody whom I appreciate a lot, is Arvo Pärt, the Estonian composer who has written fascinating music, but is being inspired by elements from different ages and different kinds of music. And there's no sharp distinction often between high and low culture. So there is an enormous impact of postmodernity on all the different kinds of parts of our culture, also on fashion. Sometimes a mixture of styles, a blurring of gender lines. It's not so much now, but there was a time when you even saw a mix of outer and underwear. What you still see is a mix of fashion and advertising, you know, with the product labels displayed on the clothing or on the shoes, Calvin Klein, Gap, Levi, and earlier generations would never want to display that kind of commercial elements. When we look at music and fashion, the prima donna maybe of postmodernism has been referred to as Madonna. Madonna was born in 1958, so she is a well-preserved phenomenon. She's 62 years old now. The New York Post wrote about her. She will do anything, say anything, wear anything, mock anything, degrade anything to draw attention to herself and to make a buck. She is the quintessential symbol of the age, self-indulgent, sacrilegious, shameless, and hollow. Well, what I've seen of her, I think kind of fits that description. Boundary blurring, religion, sex, often borrowing also from others. Then I want to spend a little time on the fine arts, because there you see the impact of postmodernity maybe even more clearly. When we look at history, then looking at a couple of centuries ago, traditional art representing reality, emphasis on beauty, art for the sake of art, originality, universality, and a very sharp difference between what was called high and low culture. That was traditional art, representing reality. But then you get a crisis in representing reality. Impressionism, post-impressionism. I think there's an O too much in that word. Cubism. And then you have other periods of Dadaism and Surrealism, and the non-representation of reality, conceptualism. Now, again, others know much more about this, and certainly my wife knows much more about this than I do. But let me illustrate that with some examples. Here, this is the pride of the Dutch Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. Rembrandt, the Night Watch, the Nachtwacht. You know, in fact, when it was painted, this painting was bigger than what you see now. But at a particular time, it was sold, and it was to be hung somewhere on a wall, and the wall was not broad enough for the picture to fit. And so they cut about a meter on the left, and they cut about a meter on the right to make the picture fit that particular wall. But it's been restored a number of years ago because it was dirty, and well, it's gone through a long process, but it's the pride of the Dutch Rijksmuseum. You can see what it means. It is a representation of reality. Well, we don't know what reality Leonardo da Vinci painted. There's still a lot of discussion about who this lady was, but you can see that she was a lady. Although even there is a little doubt, but she is, or he is, a real person. You get a little bit of a shift, a different way of dealing with reality, but it's still reality. And then as we come closer to our days, it becomes a little differently. Here an example, George Braque, girl with a cross. Well, if you look carefully, you can see that it is a face, and you can't see the cross just at the bottom of the picture. But it's a different way of dealing with reality, as is the case in the paintings of Pablo Picasso, at least most of his paintings, not all of them. He also was able to paint what people would say normal pictures, normal paintings. Pablo Picasso, he was a very, very hardworking person, and there are hundreds of his pictures all over the place. The stream called Dadaism, a cloud shepherd. Well, maybe you can see it. I found it a little difficult to determine what it exactly is. Configuration. Salvador Dali, a picture that he painted in 1944. And I suppose you have seen pictures of Salvador Dali, and they're often very, very weird. At least that's how most of us would describe them. In post-modern art, you find a large stylistic diversity. It really challenges all the previous traditions. You have what is called collage. That is that many different styles and many different materials also are used in the same work of art. Disharmony, and often installations, and sometimes installations that are just there for a short period of time and are not really meant to be lasting. The postmodern artist is not considered to be a genius, but he does something that is repeatable. It sometimes becomes really a matter of commerce. We just make a number of the same pictures or objects. Often, as I said, it's temporary installations. It doesn't have to be original. Often wants to confront, to offend, and it's very difficult to know what is so-called high or so-called low culture. Aafje and I, a couple of years ago, were in the Louisiana Museum near Copenhagen, just north of Copenhagen. It's a fantastic museum. It has also, it's at a beautiful place at the coast, just north of Copenhagen, and it's a very nice restaurant also where you can look over the fjord there. But at that time there was an installation, and they had built a replica of a McDonald's restaurant. And the artist had made a film of how water started to come into the restaurant under the door, slowly creeping up. And then as the water went up and became higher, all kinds of things started to float. Eventually, the clown also started to float through the restaurant. It became one great mess. And the drowning of McDonald's, yes. And really, it was a message that the artist wanted to portray. A very unique kind of message, but using something that really in traditional artistry would not be used. Just a few samples of postmodern art. Andy Warhol, his portrait of what's her name? Marilyn Monroe, yes, is well known, and so are his Campbell soup tins. And he made many copies of his works, and they were sold at great benefit to him. Where it's not difficult to find examples of modern art, here you find something that's quite fascinating. Japanese artist. It's in a museum in Japan, Room of Memory. And these are old windows that he had collected from Berlin, near the Berlin Wall. And when the Berlin Wall had come down, he had these things shipped, and he made this artwork, Room of Memory. Well, to say the least, it's different. An American artist, Sol LeWitt, I think he died a year or so ago. This is a pyramid, concrete blocks, and it's in the National Gallery of Art Sculpture Garden in Washington, D.C. Christo, he recently died. He was known for packing with great linen sheets all kinds of buildings, a large bridge in Paris and different other major buildings, and here the Reichstag, the government building in Berlin. Well, this of course costed a lot of money. He usually could find the sponsors to pay for it, but then after a couple of days or weeks, of course, it had to be dismantled. Is this art? Well, some people would find it difficult to consider it as art, but some people will say, yes, this is postmodern art. Other examples, Roy Lichtenstein. I think these paintings are in a museum in London, England, if I'm not mistaken. Vito Acconci, City of Words. Installations. There are many different examples of postmodern arts, performance art. But let's spend a little time on what we see in architecture. And when we compare modern buildings with so-called postmodern buildings, modern buildings, principle of unity, repetition, concrete, glass, steel. As far as the principle of unity is concerned, a good example is Frank Lloyd Wright. I remember that we visited a building in Florida a number of years ago, which was built by Frank Lloyd Wright. It was a college. And as we were walking around, somebody came to us and asked us where we came from, what we were, who we were. He was a professor there at that college, and he then gave us a tour of the campus and told us more about Frank Lloyd Wright. He also told us that most of his roofs would leak, and that sometimes, the people that would be living in a house that was built by Frank Lloyd, that they would just have to put up with that. He had also designed most of the furniture, and he would not allow them to move the furniture, but somehow they were just supposed to catch the water that would came through the leaking roof. Well, I don't know whether that is true, but clearly when you see some pictures of his buildings, then you see this principle of unity, of repetition. And when you see postmodern buildings, then you see a diversity in styles and often also in forms, a return often to ornamentation. All the buildings must tell their own story. That's the idea. And some have said, well, you know, the postmodern cathedral is really the shopping mall. And when you look at a shopping mall, you often see a great diversity of different buildings in the shopping mall and different ways of using materials and of ornamentation. A couple of examples of modern buildings. The Twin Towers, they were certainly modern buildings. Principle of university, concrete, steel. The Pan Am building in New York. Well, there are many examples that we could show. The Century Towers, for instance, in Los Angeles. But then also postmodern buildings. You know, this is quite a different kind of building. I think it's a government building. It's on the Thames in London. This is a building in Amsterdam. And you can see that this is really what is considered to be postmodern. The walls are not straight, and there is great variety in the way that different buildings are designed. And this is the same architect, also a banking building in the Bijlmer, that is Amsterdam Southeast. And another building in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, the ING Bank. It must be that the bank did not find it very efficient, because they actually sold the building and moved to something that was more traditional. But this really is a postmodern building as they come. Centre Pompidou, another example, public library in Seattle, Civic Center in Portland, Oregon. And then you wonder when you see this building. And I don't know whether you recognize this building, but this is a building that you will find in Silver Spring. And it is a building that is occupied by the headquarters of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And by no stretch of the imagination, you could call that a postmodern building. This is a very modern building. And actually, there is no suggestion that this is headquarters of a denomination. You don't see a cross. This is an old picture. If you see more recent pictures, they now actually have the name Seventh-day Adventist on the wall. It didn't used to be there, but you see also lots of antennas on top of the building. It could be an insurance office or anything like that. A very modern building, although it was only built about, 30 years ago. Well, let me, in the last few minutes of my presentation for today, say something about the postmodern in search of God. The impact that it has on spirituality. And this is where we will continue next week. But in the postmodern search of God, people have no certainty. There are no clear starting points. There's no basis on which to build. There is an enormous biblical illiteracy. And of course, that has to do with there not being any basis. There is a quiz program on the BBC in Britain, which we sometimes watch. It is called University Challenge. It's different teams from different universities competing with each other. And there are so many difficult questions that I must admit that when we watch it, most of the questions we don't know the answers to. But almost invariably, if there is a question about the Bible, a simple question, none of the students or their professors know the answer. A great biblical illiteracy and an enormous dislike of the institutional church. There is a lot of spirituality, and we will talk about that next week and also the week after. But much of that spirituality has moved away from the institutional church. Then there is a lot of attention for the non-rational, intuition, mysticism, etc. And so that is what we were looking at next week. Problems for church and theology. What has happened with the big story of Christianity? Can we rescue the big story of Christianity? When we look at one of the key aspects of pluralism, can we still maintain the uniqueness of Jesus Christ in this age of pluralism? In this age of relativism, can we still maintain that there is truth with a capital T? Or should we be more modest in our claims? Then when it comes about authority, does the Bible still have a kind of authority? Or are we left with a multitude of different interpretations? When it comes to the institutional church, do denominations have a future? Or are we moving into a fully post-denominational era? And do people still want to commit to a religious ideal or a religious community? And so that is plenty of stuff to think of next week. Well, David, that is where I wanted to stop for this week. And I'll hand it over to you or to anyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
I'm back on now.
It's very clear that this is not something one could have done in a year's study or a decade's study, but you shared with us a lifetime of study. And I think much of it you've done with your wife, Afia, doing work in different artistic settings, and she's very informed on these matters as well. So my thanks to you and my thanks to her for a lifetime of attention to these matters. Now, we'll take a break. And when we come back, I think we have a couple of options. One of them would be to pick up on the theological issues that you posed in the 10th of your themes. There was technology, literature, film, television, music, fashion, fine art, architectural styles, and God. And we could look at those themes from the search of God, but I might suppose that we could pass them on to next week because you'll be focusing on them more directly next week. And perhaps this week we can ask the question, how should the Christian community relate to all this? And that's similar to how people who lived in the modern era had to ask how they should relate to modernity, and how people in the pre-modern era had to ask themselves, how should they relate to pre-modernism? So that broad cultural question is one I think is interesting. And during the break, I'll try to find Richard Niebuhr's Christ and Culture 5 alternatives on how this could be done. And maybe that will give us something to talk about. Having said all that, we will have the discussion go wherever people want it to go. So that's just a suggestion on my part. So we'll take a break, and about 10 minutes from now, we'll start And we will begin with wherever people want to begin. Those who wish to speak, please let Forrest know. There are several people that we haven't heard from, and I would like to. These would include Karen and Donna and Kristen and Kristen and Bronwyn, people like that. We have not heard from them for a long time, if at all. So I would hope they would speak up, because we need to hear from them too. All right, 10 minutes from now, and we'll reconvene. Meanwhile, please talk to Forrest if you would like to speak.
Yes, if you would just raise your hand on the participants, that's the easiest way for me to locate you. Otherwise, just wave furiously in your window and maybe I'll pick you up. So we'll see you in 10 minutes, as David said, but I'll be watching. This was not.
Forrest, I just forwarded you that email.
Terrence, is that you?
Yeah, I just forwarded you that email from this
Okay,
morning.
all right. Thank
I'm
you.
not
very
sure
much.
who sent it to me, but
Okay, all
put
right.
some good links.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And George, did you get my chat message?
Yes, I did. I did, and I confirmed it already. So yeah, I'm very sorry for you. Yeah,
All right, well,
I'm gonna send you one now too in private. But yeah, okay, yeah, I think that we understand what all that means. Yeah. By the way, it's not raining in your place. It's a nice beach there again. You know, you.
that's true. That's true. Like Camelot, you can't, it doesn't rain before a certain time.
I didn't see Elmer Cupino today, and don't see him here. Well, he's from Pennsylvania, so he probably is. I don't know.
Yeah, who knows? Yeah.
What else?
Okay,
Maybe
well
he's treating people. You know, he's a psychiatrist, so he's probably dealing with some people.
patience.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't see Zimmerman's either. What's that you have, George?
That's a Chihuahua. Fifi is her name.
Oh, she's better looking than you are.
Oh, well, of course, that's why we have it at home. So my wife has someone, to look at. It's 50 in our family. You see, my parents' home was always 50.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. She just came here and said, okay, come. She's about 13.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, good.
I see Laura, she just came online.
Oops.
And David Johnson, I talked to Edna the other day.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. We're on that video meeting at the conference office. I'm glad to see that you've been coming to our class.
Well, I have another class at the regular church just before this, so.
Okay, okay.
David is another happy guy today, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, except for preparing for some surgery, so.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, wish you the best luck on that, whatever it is.
Yeah, thanks. Trying to stay a little more horizontal today.
When will that be? Very soon?
20th.
20th.
20th
Well,
for a hernia.
good luck to you. Hope everything goes well and a speedy recovery and everything.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Looks like I'm going to see a familiar book come up here.
Oh, Christ and culture. Let's see.
Hello, everybody. Is this a good time to start again?
Let's do it.
Okay. Can you see this pattern from Christ and culture?
Yep, yes, we can.
Okay, really quickly, these are the 5 options that H. Richard Niebuhr outlines in his book with that title. And they are, I think, pertinent to our discussion because we can ask, how ought we to relate to postmodern culture? So Niebuhr says that over the centuries, there has been one position called Christ against culture, in which the Christian community recoils in almost horror against whatever is happening culturally. The other extreme is Christ of culture. I'm not sure the word is actually of, but it's something like that, in which people who are Christians see an identity between what's happening culturally and what's happening from a Christian point of view. They see the hand of God in cultural development. Christ above culture is an interesting alternative in which people affirm what's happening culturally, but then they think of Christianity adding something to it. Like the Greeks had the virtues of wisdom, courage, temperance, and self and justice. And then on top of that, above it, the Christians added faith, hope, and love. So that sort of pattern of thinking that we find in Roman Catholicism in particular. And then Christ and culture in paradox would be the Lutheran approach, where it is thought that the Christian community has something to say to the culture, but the culture also has something to say to the Christian community. So there's a kind of interaction between the two. And then Christ the transformer of culture is more the position of John Calvin and people like that. And that is, the Christian community should see itself as the salt of the earth or the light of the world, as it tries to transform the culture, whatever it is, in a more helpful direction. So those are some options, and we can talk about those or other things, whatever the group wants to discuss. And Forrest, who's the first person who wants to speak?
Well, I have Rodney, but you did mention Kirsten, Bronwyn, Donna. I wonder if any of them would like to speak first before I get to Rodney.
Or Jan?
Yes, please.
Jan, okay. I'm sorry.
Yes, please. This is Bronwyn.
Okay, Bronwyn, you go.
Reinder, thank you for your presentation. Do you see, just a minute here. Do you see a difference between European postmodernism and American postmodernism?
You know, that's a very difficult question for me to answer because I am European. And although I have had some contact, I would say, with American culture, that has largely been within the sphere of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We lived a number of years in America, but that was very near Andrews University. And we had very little contact with people outside of the university. And although I've been many times to the States, it has usually been in the context of church meetings and going to church events and being, for instance, at Loma, etc. So it's difficult to say, to give an answer to that question, because I have more been in American subculture than in American culture.
Mm-hmm.
My sense is that it's also quite different from place to place in the States. Of course, that's true in Europe as well. You know, sections of Europe are much more postmodern than other sections. And I would think that that is true in the United States, that's certainly the Northeast and maybe the west of the United States have much more postmodern elements than many of the areas in between. So difficult to say. And that is probably one of the big problems that we have, is that we live to a large extent as Seventh-day Adventists in a subcultural bubble and are not very much aware of what is happening outside. Now, that may not be true to a group like this class, but that would be true for many Seventh-day Adventist church members in general.
Very true. You want to enter into this conversation?
Thank you.
Okay. Jan,
Well, it sounds like the women are being honored today, so that's great. Thank you for that. I wanted to ask Dr. Bruinsma, Tolkien, I've just kind of been listening to some of C.S. Lewis's books recently, and
Can you speak
of
a
course we
little
know
louder?
that he and Tolkien were friends, right? Oh, let me see. I'm not sure how to, no, I've got my, yeah, okay. Can you hear me better now?
Yes, that's better. Yes.
Okay, so C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, was it Tolkien that he was a friend
Yeah,
with?
Tolkien,
They used
yeah.
to hang out together, right? So I'm just wondering what, the view of postmodernism, it seems to me it's had a negative effect on the church. I know we're going to talk about that more next week, but I just wanted to see if you had any thoughts on C.S. Lewis's opinion of this postmodern, for instance, the Lord of the Rings and different things like that have come out of that,
Yeah,
and the effect of that on the young people of Christianity.
Yeah, and the Narnia cycle, of course, of C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, of course, were very close. I think we have an echo somewhere.
I think it's, do you have two computers going there, Reinder?
Afke, are you unmuted? Are you muted? No, she is now muted.
No,
Okay.
it was Jan's computer was doing the
Oh.
feedback, so when I muted it, it went away.
Okay. We thought we were the guilty ones.
Not this time.
Okay. But, I think it would be very difficult to put C.S. Lewis in a box. And he certainly has been influenced by many of the postmodern elements of our age. Though he went to some extent in a different direction, becoming a believer from being a non-believer, whereas usually, in many cases at least, the trend has been in the different direction. But to try to talk about the Christian faith in the way that he did, in using parables and in using this for instance, this Narnia cycle, that I would think places him in the postmodern bracket.
Okay. Jan, do you have something more you want to comment on, or?
Well, I just, I've just watched, I'm using my son as the example here because obviously I'm more familiar with his way of thinking than other people of his generation, but he has, of course he appreciated the Chronicles of Narnia, etc. But then he was very appreciative of Lord of the Rings and different, so it's, in other words, it seemed to open him up to that genre. And it just seems to me, because you pointed out the mingling of truth and error there in the, there's just a lot of danger there for young people that I don't know that our church, that maybe the church has attempted to educate our young people more than I'm aware of on this.
Well, yeah, but at the same time, there may be a mingling of error and truth, but at the same time, there is an interesting theme that we as Adventists would value, and that is actually the theme of the great controversy that you have in the Narnia Chronicles and in Tolkien's work, and which you actually find in quite a few other examples. And you know, the challenge for us would be to package our message as effectively as they did, and then maybe avoid mingling error and truth. But that it is an effective
I
way.
love that idea.
It's an effective way of actually bringing your point of view across, your message across. That is certainly the case.
I
Okay.
wonder, Reinder, your wife is an artist. Would she like to comment on any of this?
Well, then she has to unmute herself. And I don't know what she's going to say. It's usually pretty unpredictable.
And that's why we want to hear from her.
Yeah.
Okay, Afia, you're still muted. So Reinder needs to mute himself, and then you need to unmute yourself if you would like to say something. I don't want to put you on the spot.
Well, as a matter of fact, we watched an English program, Songs of Praise, which is religious songs and short stories about people who believe, who are active in churches and so forth. And there was an interesting item about a cartoon artist and a modern cartoon artist who has made a Bible in cartoons in the manga style. That is a very Japanese subject, and made of Christ a kind of a superhero. Now you can say, is that legitimate? Is that sacrilege? We have made Christ into a different person than he was also. And I think that that kind of thing belongs also in this same trend of mixing things. So that was an interesting item.
Okay. Forrest, I have other people like Beryl, Karen, Kimberly, Alyssa.
Yeah.
Nobody has to talk, but everybody should have an opportunity to talk.
Yeah, well, I've got Jeff, I see you're on here. Does Donna want to say something?
Apparently not.
Okay. Kirsten, do you have any comments? I know we've never heard from you. Well, I don't hear from you often if you do, but could you respond to what we have today?
Yes, thank you, Reinder, for this presentation. I realize I'm so postmodern. Thank you for that, and for all the other information that you gave. There are so many things that I could talk about, but maybe I pick two. First, I think we need more artists and artist things in church. I realize when artists, lay preachers preach in our churches, the sermons are beautiful because they can relate to the text on a different level than just theologians or pastors can. So they get a more complete picture. So I think we could very much benefit from that. And also, I really think that we need artist stuff in our church decorations. I mean, why do some of our church rooms have to be so empty and so? We appreciate the world and we appreciate things that God created, and we should not always have this fear of everything and anything. So we could use a little art in our church, not becoming too Catholic like people are always afraid of, but the world is pretty, let's show it. So we could benefit from that. And also, since I realized I'm very postmodern, I really think there's a benefit of postmodernism for us. We could see differences, that they can be very much valuable. We don't have to fear all of the differences, and we should leave our bubble, like you said. We should leave our Adventist bubble once in a while. And maybe not saying that everything is relative, nothing matters anymore, or everything is equal. No. We could have a more complete picture looking at different perspectives. And maybe one approach is like you did in one of your books, Reinder, having, the difference between what is core Christianity and what are non-salvation issues. So we can have the core, we should fight for this truth, state this truth, and then we could allow for a variety of things in non-salvation issues. Maybe this would be an approach. Thank you.
Well, if I may respond, yes, it's no surprise that you say that you are postmodern, because I think that is true. Even though most of us are a mix, and maybe in some areas you are still modern, or you're happy to be modern, whereas in certain areas you are postmodern. And that also has to do with the difference of generations. When I look at my children, and they are now, of course, adults in their 50s, but they were very postmodern and are very postmodern. And that is actually, as I said last week, what got me interested in the subject. When it comes to art and artists, art has been neglected in our church. And there's only a few colleges that have a really good art department. I have worked for quite a few years in my working life for the church in the publishing area. And for instance, in the 6+ years that I spent in Africa in the arena of publishing, I looked at the various publishing houses that we have on the African continent. And at that time, we had about 600-700 employees in those publishing houses. Among them were less than 5 full-time editors. And I don't think that any of them had a full-time designer. But almost all the stuff that was happening was imported and reprinted, and a reuse of other stuff. And that is what you find, even in the United States, where the situation is a lot better. Still, we have always money to spend on equipment when it comes to the media. But then we do not have money to spend on salaries for people who are really creative.
Right.
If you look at the publishing scene, but also at the television scene, for instance, you take Hope Channel. We can find the money to build the studio. We can find the money to buy all the equipment, but to really hire first-class artists and people who know about screenwriting and people who are truly creative, that is where our problem is. And we once were, my wife and I, we once were in our publishing house in Denmark. And we looked at the books that they had published. And this could be said for many other places. So I'm not getting at Denmark, but this could be said. And so we were shown the various books that were there in the bookcase. And then after picked out one book and said, now that really has a nice and attractive cover. And so the then publishing director said, well, sorry to say, but that's the only book that we have not published, but is from another publisher. And there is definitely that lack of creativity and the undervalue of artists. And that is true for the churches and the way we sometimes build some of our churches. We have some beautiful churches, but you know, sometimes they're not, in some countries, not clearly identified even as Christian buildings. I traveled with somebody in Uganda, and we were driving along the road, and then we were passing a church, and I said, okay, hey, that's a Seventh-day Adventist church. And the pastor with whom I drove said, how do you know? I said, well, that church doesn't have a cross, but it has a satellite dish. And that's a bit typical of where we are. So these are just some comments on what you said, Kirsten.
Okay, Forrest, here are some names I have. Beryl, Karen, Judy, Kimberly, Alyssa, Laura, and Carol and Pat. You know, 46 years in the classroom has taught me that there are often very thoughtful people who have something to share, but they're a little hesitant, and others are more comfortable speaking up. So I think our job is to give a person an opportunity to speak without feeling any pressure whatsoever. So if we call on you and this is not a good time, just say, not this time, and we'll move on to the next person. So there's no pressure whatsoever, but we would like to give everybody an opportunity to be heard. Okay, Forrest.
Okay, Karen, did you want to say something?
Just very briefly, since I am being offered the opportunity, I, with Kirsten, have appreciated this presentation because I do realize how postmodern I really am, and that really informs my understanding of myself. It's been very helpful, and potential conflicts and confluences with modern culture and my family and friends. It also helps me identify a frustration that I feel with our church. We really have something the world needs to hear. And I think it's not a problem of our church only, but a problem that our church shares, is that by the time you reach leadership, it's probably because you've aged into it from decades of experience, and you're not a part of the current cultural zeitgeist. And so we have modernists trying to speak to postmodernists and failing. I can't think who it was who spoke before Kirsten, you know, but mentioning C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, and your own Afsha, am I saying it right? The mention, I'm really excited. I've got to Google the manga Bible. We need to say our message in the language people can hear. And I think we're still sometimes in my very conservative local church, we're still speaking in the language of the Victorians. If you can't get the gospel from Ellen White, that's your problem. And I think that we're really missing such a great opportunity with that attitude. And I would like to hear your reflections on that. Thank you.
Well, maybe I should not speak too much because there's so many other people who are speaking, but I think you're very right that that's my strong belief, we should find ways of speaking the language of the people, of the culture in which we live. And we are failing to a large extent. I will come back to this next week and the week after in particular, when I would like to say a few things about spirituality, and like to point out that in many ways, the spirituality that we have in the church is kind of an institutionalized spirituality. I don't know whether you people recognize that today the week of prayer starts. But most of us have lost interest in that kind of spirituality. Yet this is the kind of spirituality that the church pushes. Whereas many of us are looking for a different kind, more postmodernly informed kind of spirituality. And that is, as you say, that is a clash between the modern and the postmodern way of living your faith, living your Adventism. And the first step, and you said it well, is that we understand ourselves, where we are, and that we help people understand where we are in this spectrum of modern and postmodern. It's only when we begin to see that. And talking about this topic, I've often had people who said, now I see where my son or where my daughter is coming from. I didn't understand that. And that is the beginning of communicating. Thank you.
Okay, Forrest, I have Laura, Judy, Kimberly, Alyssa, Carol, Beryl, and Pat.
Well, Laura, do you want to speak?
Do you mean me?
Laura Z.
Oh, yes. Well, if I'm given the opportunity, then I will take it also.
Go ahead.
I don't have much to say that is different from what's been said already. I'm sorry I missed the first hour. I'm going to have to go back and watch the recording. But I was here last week for that discussion. About 8 years ago, our youth pastor gave a sermon on postmodernism in our local church here. And that was the first time I had considered that I was likely postmodern, and I had never considered it before. And it was enlightening, and I think it fell hard on the congregation because it's a modern congregation and not postmodern, largely. But for those who were willing to listen, it was certainly eye-opening and important to hear. And I would only also say on the topic of artists, it's something I've put a lot of thought into, because I've found myself over the years the person who seemed to be called upon often for artistic flair in the church. And while I've always been so thankful for the opportunity to provide that to my church, I've always been sad to see how little it was regarded. There would always be a few people who would have regard for the time spent, but just as many begrudged the money spent or even the time spent. And that really does make me sad, because I've had exposure to other churches where they so gladly spend time and effort on the beauty of their sanctuary, and I feel like it provides a lot to the service. And I've always really tried to get an understanding for myself of why Adventists. I understand historically why we are that way, but it's hard for me to understand why it's persisted for so long. Anyway, that's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you. Did you want to respond to that, Reinder?
No, let's have a few more people respond, and then maybe I can say a few things. But if I am, I tend to be speaking too long, and then the participants won't have a chance to voice their opinion. And what we just heard from Laura was more a statement than a question, but I fully concur with what she said.
Yeah, it sounds like she's an artist. I think we need to take note of that. So I have Judy, Kimberly, Alyssa, Carol, Beryl, and Pat.
What about
Hi.
Judy? Who's?
Hi, this is Kim. I'm sorry, I can't raise my hand because I can't get it to work, but I would like to speak
All right.
if I may.
All right, go ahead, Kim.
First of all, thank you so much for your presentation again. I probably more have a comment like Laura did. I'm a very artistic postmodern person also. And going back to the history of Adventism, in my opinion, Adventism has never developed a art form for its particular church. You will see churches that have done that. As far as it goes with artistic people in the church, I think they stop short of, they're happy to have people who arrange flowers, they're happy to have people who can choose paint, but artists by nature are very non-conventional people. They don't fit into a conservative box. Through the years, what I have seen when people who have been serious artists convert to Adventism, the first thing that I've seen is, oh, I'm giving up my Western art. I'm giving up this. Is there any evangelist who wants me to paint something for them? There's a huge problem in the Adventist church. I think it is a fear of the unconventional, in my opinion, as to why it isn't developed, why it has never been developed. It is something that I'm rather passionate about, but I don't find that I have ever found many people in the Adventist church who care that much about it. So anyway, I'm off my soap opera. Off.
Unfortunately,
Soapbox.
we have lost many artists who have come into our church. And at least that is what we have seen here in our part of the world, that it's very difficult when you have really creative people to keep them in the church. And so more power to you, Kimberly, if you can stick with it and not get too frustrated.
Okay, what about Elisa Kido? Did you want to say anything?
Apparently not. Let's keep moving then.
Judy. Oh, wait a minute.
Yes, Joan Sabate, I would like to interject here if I respond to Kimberly, if I may.
Okay, go ahead.
Yes, I mean, I remember reading once, so it's not my idea, but it made me think that the churches, I mean, or the different denominations, they have different emphasis. And the Adventist church, the emphasis is on time and time issues, not only from the second coming, but also for the Sabbath that we keep. So most of the theology goes around time, and probably as far as but not about space. I mean, we don't have a place like in other denominations that the headquarters is the place of worship and you have to visit. So the issues of space, I mean, are not emphasized, if anything, are de-emphasized. So no wonder that in the artistic world, I mean, the Adventist church has emphasized music. That is an issue of tempo and time. And we have prominent and well-known conductors. But as far as issues of space, that is, the 2 dimensions or the 3 dimensions of a sculpture or paintings, I mean, since it's de-emphasized, these artists suffer a lot and probably they leave the church.
Okay, thank you. Did you, Reinder, you want to respond to that?
Well, I can only say amen to that. And I think that's a very worthwhile comment to say that we are so focused on time that some of the other elements become neglected. Time, and there's also that aspect that, of course, we must use our time well. And I think many people have the suspicion that these artists, they are using so much time for what? They could be using their time much more profitable. And, but you're correct. Space is not important, or at least less important, but time is, yeah.
Okay, Judy, did you want to say something?
Yes, I just was really intrigued with the idea of the cartoon Bible with Jesus as superhero, and especially the next statement about we do that too. Could you unpack that a little more?
Well, do we depict Jesus as a Jew?
Okay, Afia, we want to hear from Afia on that, I think.
Do we depict Jesus as a Jew? We depict him as a Caucasian, a nice and smooth man, which I'm sure he wasn't. And that's what I meant.
When we look at the Bible by 10-volume children Bible by Maxwell, you know, what is it called? The Bible story. And you see Jesus, he is a Caucasian American who just walked out of an American park.
Easy there. I sold a lot of those books.
Yeah, I did too. And I can actually say that I published the Dutch edition. But that is how we have portrayed Jesus. And at first I was quite shocked when I saw pictures of Jesus as a person of a very different ethnicity. And at one time I was somewhat uncomfortable with it. But then if I have the right to depict Jesus like I am, then people in other cultures and with other features, they have the right to depict Jesus. He became man. He did not become a Dutchman. He did not become an American. He became man in a way, as Afi just said, as a Jew, with the characteristics of a Jewish person. But he also became man in a very general sense, in that he was a man like all of us. And so if we need pictures to bring that home to us, we should feel free to depict him also like any of us is. And so, yeah, whether you want to depict him in a cartoon, that will be a long discussion, and some people will be very, well, they don't like that. But then for a long time, we were not willing to see Jesus depicted in a film. But somehow we have grown, most of us have grown to the idea that apparently for a lot of people, that is a powerful way of saying something about Christ, in particular in a time when people are not reading. So, yeah, this is an interesting discussion, and that comes back to what David said at the beginning of this period of discussion. How do we deal with culture? Do we put culture in the service of our testimony, or do we put culture in opposition to our witness, to our testimony? I have a sense that it has to be a critical combination of the two, that Christ always stands in judgment of culture, but he was not outside of culture, and our way of presenting him should not be outside of culture.
Okay, that's really, you know, if I could say something here. One time one of my colleagues who's Asian came to faculty meeting, and he was in tears. It was really quite stirring, and we asked, what's happening? And he showed us a picture of Jesus in the form of a Chinese sage. Jesus looked like Confucius. And to see Jesus portrayed that way for him was deeply, deeply moving. And I think that there was some wisdom there.
Yeah.
Right, David, before we go to another lady, Rodney Corker's had his hand up for quite a while. I'm sure it's tired right now. So Rodney, come to you.
Thank you, Reinder. I love the way that you teach. Very simple. You don't make things more complex than they need to be. We all know where you're going to start, and you tell us where you're going to finish, and you do that every time. So I salute you, man. But one of the hallmarks of a postmodern world that I think of is not art, but it's the world of finance. Since the 1960s, there has been a rapid change in the world of finance that we as Adventists and Christians need to keep an eye on. And that is the rapid development of stock markets, of bundling debt and selling debt, the development of mutual funds, of bonds of all kinds, of credit instruments, insurance types. The new icon of the postmodern world could be the cryptocurrencies, for example, and the volatility there within. There's a lot of risk, there's a lot of complexity within the financial world and the financial markets that have developed since the 1960s. You've got the ECU, you've got world agreements, you've got the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, free trade agreements, changing tariffs. There's a lot of instability, a lot of it short-term, some of it's maybe long-term. But in terms of the setting up of a culture and the influences that we need to look at, the culture of the financial world is something that I feel I need to watch, and I think it is very, very relevant to Christianity and to world stability. And that can change very, very quickly, and we need to understand it and keep an eye on it. Thank you.
Yeah, and I agree, but at the same time, I must confess that is something I understand very little about. And when I see at this moment in this time of Corona, when all states, at least in the Western world, are spending huge amount of money in rescue packages, and they borrow money, and then I wonder, who are they borrowing from, and how much can you borrow, and when in the world are we going to pay that back? It's just something that bewilders me. And
part of my point.
I just have
point.
the uncanny feeling that somehow that is going to break down, that whole system, that it's not sustainable in the long run. But I must admit that we need to have a presentation on that so that at least I can understand a little bit more of what is happening in the financial world. Thank you.
Okay. I'm looking here. Carol, did you want to say something? Okay. Oh. All right, I guess not. Who else do you see, David? Beryl.
I have Pat and Michelle and
Beryl.
Beryl. Okay, that's all right. Nobody should.
Oh, wait a minute. No, she just came on.
Oh, okay.
Come on, Beryl.
She's muted though.
You're muted. You're muted, Carol or Beryl.
One second, you're still muted.
Hold down on your space bar. That will help.
Okay, I'm gonna try to unmute her.
Okay.
If I can find, let's see. So is it Pat and Ron? Oh, there, Beryl. Okay, I see. All right, here we go. I sent the message, but that would have to be a button that gets clicked on then to get unmuted.
Okay.
Carol, do you see the button on there that says unmute or okay?
I'll unmute.
There we speak to us.
Okay, let's come back and ask
Okay.
Beryl to keep looking at that. One more time, Beryl, if you just hold the space bar down on your keyboard, it should work.
She's using her iPad.
I see. Okay.
Okay. All right. We'll work. You'll get you another time. Pat.
Yes, that's me.
All right.
I have had so many thoughts during the presentation last week and this week that I'm not sure that I can organize them very well. But first of all, starting with culture, my husband and I both grew up in Adventist ghettos. I was at Walla Walla, he was at PUC. We grew up around those areas. So we did grow up in an Adventist culture. However, after college, we both left that bubble. And neither one of us have worked for the denomination since. We have worked various places around the country, actually, and including 1 year in Turkey. So we have gotten out of the bubble and away from our culture. And in that respect, I think that I think that I'm modern because of my age. I'm over 80, but probably also postmodern because I have seen the trend away from the organized church and more into religion, and feeling like people can be very religious and very spiritual without being an active church member. And that has been true, I think, in our experience and our exposure with people, regardless of what their faith is, including the Muslim friends that we made in Turkey, that I feel like the spirituality is so much, so important in how we approach people, how we approach our lives, and how we plan ahead.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Pat and Reinder. Any response?
Yeah, I think that is very true, that spirituality should not be confined to the space within the walls of the church. And in fact, for many people have found it difficult to find the kind of spirituality in our denomination that they were longing for. I heard somebody say, it was in Britain, he said, well, you know, on Sabbath, I go to church, to the Adventist church, because I want to hear the truth. And on Sunday, I go to the Anglican church because I want to worship. And you know, I can understand that. At the same time, I'm so sorry when somebody cannot find the kind of spirituality that he or she looks for within the Adventist church. You know, with all the things that I wished were different in the church, I still am trying and want to keep on trying, find that spirituality in the Seventh-day Adventist Church and make my contribution in promoting the kind of openness to spirituality that people need. At the same time, I also belong to those people, and I think that is true for most people in this group, and increasingly among large numbers of Adventists, at least in the Western world, that is that we seek our inspiration, mostly not from Adventist authors, but mostly from non-Adventist authors who we find are more inspiring, more challenging to read, and to be, a greater source of inspiration for us. So yeah, let's not confine spirituality to what happens in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but at the same time, for those of us who are part of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, let's be part of a movement that tries to promote an openness to different kinds of spirituality that will attract also postmodern people more than they do today.
Okay, David Johnston, did you have your hand up?
I did. I agree with Pat and Reinder there. I find myself a modernist when it comes to science. And I find my church perhaps pre-modernist on that. They just can't be dragged into the 19th or 20th century even. And even thinking that. And yet I find myself postmodernist when it comes to art and music. And as Reinder said, I find myself thinking along with the Episcopalians, and when I want to hear some good music on Sunday, just because we don't often have that, and too much, sometimes when I want good organ music, I will tune into Loma when they can play it, and La Sierra's first church, or I will tune in with my friends at the National Cathedral here. And just because that's where my roots are. And I'm not getting that in most Adventist churches.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We are very much one of a kind. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I see some hands. Karen, did you want to get back on with something here?
Just to observe, when Pat was speaking, it struck me, so many elements of postmodernism that I identify with have created tension in me because they're mostly portrayed within my Adventist circles as negative. And I've really appreciated the presentation and the conversation here, pointing the light on the idea that it's not negative. In fact, it can be very positive. It's just different. And God uses every way of being human to glorify himself.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Now, there's somebody that's name's not up here, but I know she's there next to Elmer. Dorothy, did you want to say anything? I guess.
Not really. I do have a daughter-in-law who's an artist, a full-time artist, making enough money to more than cover her expenses. And she took her degree at Walla Walla. That's all I have to say.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, who else did you? Oh, I know I've got Danilo on deck here, but I'm trying to think. Who was another lady that we have here, David? Heather, did you say? I don't. Okay. Danilo, I'm going to go to you now.
I can really relate to our artist brothers and sisters because I've been in sciences pretty well all my life, and I have frequently been confronted by people in the church as somehow being an oddball because science is not the way to heaven. And it almost seemed to me that well, if I was interested in sciences, I'm straying on a strange territory. And that put me in a strange position because frequently it made me the target of various people from various church communities who would either have a beef with the church, and they would infer from my being in science that I also have a beef with the church. And so they would then unload on me whatever their beef was. On the other hand, I would also be on occasion confronted by people that, we should be teaching, preaching, and healing until the Lord comes. Anything else is just a waste of time, and it's a diversion in a sense. So I can appreciate the attitude that our artists, brothers and sisters, have experienced. Perhaps they have experienced this even more intensely because at least our educational institutions have required some science teachers here and there. Whereas I don't know of a single art instructor at Loma Linda in any school, in any department, for example. Now, I could be mistaken. There could be some people somewhere hiding. It would be nice if they're around. But it strikes me that both art and science, when it comes really down to it, is an attempt to reach the truth. And that also is the purpose of faith. Now, we do not easily see the connection between faith and science that often, and certainly not so much between faith and art. And frequently we don't think that there is any connection between art and science, other than being some department somewhere. So I think there is much to do. It seems to me that we need to learn to value truth regardless of what form it's presented in and how we come across it. We need to be willing to learn and grow. Otherwise, we can't have knowledge built in midair. Unless there is learning, there can be no knowledge. And unless there is faith, there can be no learning. So we need to firmly see these connections. May God help us all.
Okay. Reinder, in response?
Well, what is there to say? This is very true. There are different ways of dealing with truth. But I think the postmodern person would say, look, we will never have the full truth, capital T. We are all groping in some way to find the truth. And science and art and religion, they're all part of the human endeavor to try to find meaning and to find truth. And that's a lifelong journey for each one of us. And that is also a project that is ongoing for any community. As soon as we say we have it, this is the truth, there's nothing more to learn, then we have failed.
Okay, thank you. David, I don't have any more hands up. Do you have someone else? Oh, is there Michelle? Did you want to say something? Okay, David, to you. Oh, wait a minute. Terrence done. Terrence, you go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I agree completely with the idea of a church or a philosophy of a God that must mature in order to be relevant to the world we live in. And if our church is denying science, then it's automatically going to be stagnating into what I think you call a modern position, but I would say it's an ancient position of stagnation. And I think we've been there way too long. It's time to get a view of God, a view of a superior being that is relevant to all people. To do that, I think we ought to have some long discussions about what is really, really, truly important to the teachings we hold. Is it important to know how to calculate all these numbers and have an eschatology that predicts the end of time? Or is it more important to have a message of love and freedom and equality that seems to be the search that all people have had throughout history? If we go back to the ancient philosophers, they all had the same desires for love and freedom and equality. And now with this epidemic, it seems to me we have been shown very clearly that there's no difference between Jew and Gentile. You don't have to become a Jew to be accepted. God is coming for everyone. And I think postmodernism has become kind of a pejorative to many people, when in fact it is the direction we have to be going if we're going to maintain relevancy.
Yes. Let me say that, if you're interested, 4 years ago, I wrote a little book called Facing Doubt. And part of that book deals with the question of what is relevant and what is less relevant. Not everything has the same kind of importance. And we must try to make the distinction between the things that are really of primary importance and the things that are maybe of secondary or tertiary importance.
Yeah, I read a great book similar to that, probably called The Gift of Doubt.
Yeah.
Gary
Yeah.
Parker.
Right.
Another great book.
Yeah.
Okay, David, I don't see any other hands. I'm not sure.
Okay. Does anybody else want to speak?
Could I just add a little bit?
Sure.
Since we're talking a little bit about postmodernism, I'm a little bit in two minds about that for the following reason. Postmodernism is viewed rather, how should I say, somewhat dimly by science, particularly by practicing scientists. And the reason is because it would seem that postmodernism doesn't only recognize the fact that we're all groping for truth, they are suggesting that there is no such thing as truth. And that's where we part ways. We cannot at the same time seek science and undermine its very foundation. The very premise of science is based on the simple assumption that there is such a thing as reality, and we can learn something truthful about that by studying in an organized way. If there is no such thing as truth or reality for that matter, if we're all just a simulation in some giant computer, or as some religious folk have said, we're all just ideas in the mind of God, meaning we don't actually even exist, then what is there to learn? We're just manipulated things in somebody else's concepts.
I think
the problem.
I think, though, that there is a difference between saying there is no truth and saying we are all on our way of finding the truth. And I think postmodernism has made us aware of the fact that even within science, it's not always the unmitigated blessing that science was thought to be in the modern era. Science is making discoveries that are beneficial to mankind, but is also doing many things that are not so beneficial. Postmodernism also points out that there are traditions within science, and that sometimes scientists, because of the way they are sponsored and the way they're looking for sponsorships from the business world, is sometimes looking with a certain bias, or even looking for certain things and not looking for other things. Now, obviously, you know much more about science than I do, but in the modern period, science was like an idol. Postmodernism has helped us to see there are different aspects to science as well, and we should be critical as far as that is concerned. Postmodernism is also making believers aware of the fact, and certainly also me as an Adventist believer, aware of the fact that truth is not equal to a statement of 28 different points, but it's a journey towards an ever better understanding of who God is and what he wants from us. So saying that there is no truth is, I think, different from saying that we are on a journey towards truth, but we haven't gotten there. But this is a topic, David, that we could maybe spend a couple of more hours on. But
Okay, let's do that. Maybe not just right now. Maybe I can make one quick comment before we call it a day, and that is, really, there's no such thing as postmodernism. There are only postmodernisms, plural, right? By definition, this is a pluralistic movement, and modernism has at least two different streams. If we look at the stream that comes down from Descartes, very deductive, and there's a sort of exhaustion with deductive reasoning that has occurred in that long tradition. But there's another tradition of modernism that begins with Francis Bacon in Anglo-America. And that's a different kind of modernism, which was very scientific. And that kind of modernism has yielded a different kind of postmodernism, which is far more affirmative of science than other forms are. So there are a variety of forms of postmodernism. I think Nancy Murphy has written well on this topic, and David Ray Griffin has written well on this topic, the varieties of postmodernism. So yeah, we are looking very carefully at the dominant stream of postmodernism, but there are others, particularly in Anglo-America. I'm surprised that Richard Rorty, who's an American pragmatist, was included in this list by the authorities that Reinder cited, because I would have put him more on the Anglo-American side than on the continental European side. And he, of course, follows William James, John Dewey, that's whole school of American pragmatism. So we'll look forward to more on that. Okay, here is our benediction, and thank you all. I put a lot of people on the spot, and I'm glad I did. I really feel pretty smart for having done that, because we got some really, really good comments, and I'm also pleased that if a person doesn't want to speak, there's no shame in that whatsoever. So we want to provide opportunities, but no pressure. Here we go. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
Amen. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great discussion, David.
Thank you, McKinley. We didn't hear from you.
Thanks to everyone.
Well, it was good to hear everybody else speak. And I like the conversations about artists and so on and so forth. But next week I'll have a comment.
Good. At least one.
Hi, Bronwyn.
Bronwyn, you have to unmute yourself.
Hi, McKinley.
Have a good Sabbath.
You know, McKinley, I was thinking of Rodney Corker's conversation or contribution about postmodern finances. And it seems to me that maybe you are deep in that world of postmodern finances. We need to explore that with you a little bit.
Yes, definitely. I identified with Rodney's comments because a lot of that is affecting the unfolding of technology and the changes in the energy economy that we're seeing. So.
Thank you. We'll get back to you.
All right. Thanks. Have a good Sabbath, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Bruinsma.
Thank you. And see you next week.
Yes.
Bye, Afia.
See you next week also.
Yes, good to hear you.
Hi, bud. Edward Racine, are you still there? Apparently not. Thank you,
David.
Afia. Yes.
Appreciate your leadership, my friend.
Oh, thank you. I was hoping we could hear from you. Are you all right?
I'm all right. I tend to get sleepy.
No.
And that's a shame. I did pick up on most of it for sure.
Yeah, no, my wife rightly is frustrated with me when we sit down to watch television and I sort of doze off. That's not fair to her, is it?
Yeah, I do that with television for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we haven't seen your son for a while.
I thought he would be there today, and I don't know why he isn't.
Okay, he's all right?
Yes, I spoke with him last night, and I thought he would be there here today.
Okay, all right. So long he's doing fine, that's good.
Yeah. Really appreciate these Zoom sessions very much, David.
Thank you, bud. Thank you very much. Well, I should have mentioned it. We'll try to have a financial meeting next couple of weeks or so, maybe start at 9 o'clock and just review where we are financially. We're in a very good place financially, and I think we should share that with the group. Our group has been very, very supportive, and let's take a look at that and then see what we want to do for next year.
Well, we must never forget Reinder. What's there not to like about Dr. Bruinsma?
That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
All right. See you next Sabbath.
All right.
Thank you.